And the intention, quite clearly, of, again, the world's governing class and the banking class and the media class and the scientific class is, yet again, to have another go at putting this World Government Treaty into place. Now, they've learnt from the fuss that arose after the previous World Government Treaty draft was exposed and torn to shreds, that if they openly admit in the treaty draft that world government is what they're after, they're not going to get away with it. So this time, they're going to be more cautious. What they're going to do is very, very carefully to put together what looks like an entirely reasonable treaty with a very small bureaucracy, with a very small right to attract levies on a capitation basis or on a GDP basis from each member state. But the moment you give that central body the power to start getting wealth from taxpayers' pockets, that's when it starts to grow into the eventual undemocratic, bureaucratic monster that is world government. And we've seen it all before in the dismal dictatorship that the European Union has become. That started out just as a tiny group of bureaucrats who had been given the power to levy a certain amount of money from each member state of what became the European Union, so as to make sure after the Second World War that there was enough coal and steel for everyone to rebuild Europe after the war. A perfectly sensible technocratic arrangement. But then the bureaucrats and the bankers got together and they said, why don't we turn this into a Europe-wide government? And did they intend that this should be an elected government? Of course not. Did they intend that you and me, ordinary people, should have a vote to decide whether, to what extent, and how this government should be formed and should run? Certainly not. They intended that this should be a tyranny of the governing elite over the governed. And if you go back to the founding principles of the United States of America, what did Jefferson have to say about that? He said, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every tyranny over the mind of man. And here we have the European Union, a regional example of what is fully intended to become a worldwide tyranny, introduced by little steps. They can't do it in a big step. They tried that, they got caught out, and at Copenhagen they failed. At Bonn they will try again, and from now on it'll be a little step here and a little step there. But the slow approach, the reason why they didn't try the slow approach from the start is they know the problem with the slow approach. And the slow approach has this difficulty, that all of this nonsense is predicated on the false assumption that humankind is having such a drastic effect on global climate that without a dictatorial world government, nothing will stop huge terrestrial worldwide disaster. Now, in fact, there isn't going to be any disaster. If you look at the scientific literature, even among those in the literature, an increasingly small band who believe that global warming is a global crisis, they don't believe that it's a crisis that's going to lead to the sort of catastrophes you see in Al Gore's mawkish sci-fi comedy horror movie. They now know that sea level is only rising at around 1 foot per century. Well, hey, it's been rising at 4 feet per century for the whole of the last 11,400 years. It's risen by well over 400 feet in that time. So if it's slowed down to 1 foot per century, because frankly, pretty well all the ice that's on the land has long since melted and gone into the sea, it's not going to rise very much further, whatever you do. They know this now. Likewise, they know perfectly well that the deserts are not going to extend themselves. They're going to contract, because the Sahara Desert has been measured. It's lost 300,000 square kilometers in the last 30 years to vegetation. And the Bedouin and the nomadic tribes and the Targui, they're all traveling around, going back and settling areas of the Sahara which have never been lived in living memory, because of the greening of the Sahara. So that's not happening. Likewise, temperature is not rising as predicted, or in the last 15 years at all. I arranged for a journalist from the BBC to interview Dr. Jones of the now disgraced climate research unit at the University of East Anglia. And one of the questions I suggested to the BBC was, has there been any statistically significant global warming in the last 15 years? And Jones, albeit through gritted teeth, had to admit that there hadn't been. Now, had he or his unit ever said that before? No. Had the BBC ever thought to ask a question like that before? No. But I got in there and made them do it, and he had to answer truthfully that there hasn't been any global warming for 15 years. In fact, there's been global cooling for the last 8 years at a rapid and significant extent. In the Arctic, in the Antarctic, I should say, that global cooling has been going on for 30 years. And the sea ice extent around the Antarctic reached a maximum in 2007, just 3 weeks after there was a 30-year minimum of sea ice in the Arctic. So globally, sea ice is not changing. In Greenland, in fact, and in most of Antarctica, the sea ice is rapidly thickening. 90% of the world's glaciers are advancing. All you hear about is the 10% that are receding. So whenever you actually look at what's happening in the real climate and look at it from the data rather than from what you read about in the newspapers or hear from Al Gore and other politicians and global warming profiteers, you find not only is there no reason to suppose that there will be any adverse consequences from global warming, but in the real world at the moment there certainly aren't any. So put all these things together and you have a non-problem dressed up as though it were a problem to allow people with a frankly dictatorial political agenda to create a new bureaucratic centralist worldwide system of government based on the model already applied regionally in the European Union, with absolute control in the hands of an unelected, self-perpetuating, oligarchical, dictatorial, tyrannical elite. And I, for one, will be in Bonn and Cancun, which is the meeting that's due to happen this December of the states parties to the Framework Convention. I will be there to stop them. That's, of course, exactly what the environmental movement is trying to do. The environmental movement is no longer concerned with the environment, if it ever was. My dear friend, Eric Ellington, who sadly died a few weeks ago as we record this, he was a founder of Greenpeace. Now, there was a man, he couldn't be nicer, he was a true believer in leaving the planet alone and not making a mess of it, respecting our fellow creatures, respecting plant life, respecting the cleanness of the air and the oceans in a sensible and proportionate manner. He was a true environmentalist, as were the original founders of Greenpeace. Within a year or two, those original founders had been driven out because the movement became taken over very rapidly by people who didn't care a tinker's damn about the environment. What they were concerned about was politics. They wanted to use the environmental movement as a way of shutting down the West from within and doing so without a shot being fired. These were communists. Communists, pure and simple, and they still are. Greenpeace is a worldwide communist organization. I call them the traffic light tendency, the Greens too yellow to admit they're really reds. And it's the same in the Environmental Defence Fund, which now has assets greater than those of some countries. It's the same with the NRDC, it's the same with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, it's the same with Friends of the Earth. Why do we need all these different environmental bodies all saying the same thing? Because they're all essentially communist in their outlook and communist in their ambitions. This does not mean that every member of these organizations is a signed-up Marxist. Of course it doesn't. There are a lot of people who belong to these organizations who genuinely, but foolishly, believe that they are joining environmental organizations. Once they would have been. Now they are not. There's a new agenda there. It's an agenda which is deeply inimical to the West in particular. And if you realize how very curious that is, because the West is, of course, the region of the world which has cleaned up its environmental act more than any other. Where is the worst pollution to be found in the world? In the communist countries. That's where. In places like Russia, which is now cleaning up its act because it's no longer communist. Why has the atmospheric concentration, for instance, of methane stopped rising since about the year 2000? Because 10 years before, communism collapsed in Russia, the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly the government of Russia said, hey, we don't want to be allowing all that methane to escape from the Siberian pipeline right across Russia to Europe, because every cubic foot of methane that we let out into the atmosphere through leaks in that pipeline is a cubic foot we can't overcharge Europe for. So they went along from one end of the pipeline to another over the following 10 years, repairing it. As they did so, the atmospheric concentration of methane, which had been climbing rapidly ever since that pipeline was built, began to stabilize, and since the year 2000, there's been virtually no increase in methane concentration. What does that tell you? It tells you that the communist countries are the ones that are the gross polluters. If you go to China now, it is disgusting, the quality of the air, the number of people who die, children who die. Even in Peking, right at the center of the dismal Chinese Communist Empire, dying because the air quality is so filthy. Why? Not because China these days can't afford to use clean burn coal technology. Of course they could afford it, but they don't bother to afford it because to them the deaths of millions of their own population don't matter. Why don't they matter? Because they're not democratic. So they don't have to listen to what their people think or the cries of the children as they die of lung diseases caused by the filthy pollution of communism. And yet it is the communists in the West who are trying to say that what the West should do is to shut its economy down and allow the Chinese and all the other dirty communist economies to thrive. Now, clearly, if you were an environmentalist genuinely concerned for the environment, you would be spending all your time and money and effort, wouldn't you, on getting the Chinese to clean up their act. In fact, I think what we should do is concentrate the entire vast capital wealth, now amounting to close on $1 billion of all these environmental organizations, and give it to the Chinese on the understanding that every penny of it is to be spent on cleaning up their power stations, introducing fly ash scrubbers, and introducing circulating fluidized bed technology, introducing pelletized coal and crushed coal so that you get a much, much cleaner burn. You can achieve, effectively, stoichiometric burn, which is virtually no pollution with modern processes used in the West. That is the part of the world where the cleanup needs to happen in the communist countries, and yet are the environmental organizations seen here campaigning on the streets to make China clean up its act? Funnily enough, they're not. Instead, they're on the streets here saying that we mustn't build clean burn coal-fired power stations, which do no harm to the environment at all. We mustn't dig coal out of the ground, out of the mountains of Appalachia, and then carefully put the mountains back afterwards, which is what happens at the moment. No. Instead, the Chinese can go on raping their own landscape, destroying their own children with dirty, old-fashioned technologies, and yet it's we in the West who've already cleaned up our act that are the chief targets of the environmental movement. And it is this implausibility, this central implausibility at the heart of the environmental movement, which is why I don't believe it to be any longer an environmental movement. I'm putting it to you that what it really is a movement which is dedicated to communism and communism only, and the environment is merely being used as an increasingly watery and transparent pretext.